Fractals and butterfly effect. Tiny little differences can have consequences that magnify and amplify into a butterfly effect. Cellular automata. Simple rules can create complex patterns. Which are the requirements for emergent complexity? Elements are constituents. Building blocks which are binary. Either they're filled or not filled. Then, a simple rule as to how the next generation emerge, but none of the rules have anything to do with the next generation. It's all local rules built around what the neighborhood is like for each one of them, and out comes complex patterns. But in most cellular automata, the patterns stop after a while, they extinct. What is telling us is that small number of starting states that succeed produce a small number of mature states that look similar to each other. Which means you can start with a lot of different conditions, and you will wind up with a lot of smaller number of stereotypical patterns. Called convergence. You can start with different forms and they'll converge over time. Also, if you look at the beginning of this, you can't know how it's going to end. The starting state gives you no predictive power about the mature state equals is a nonlinear system. Cellular automata. The majority extinct, few mature. It shows convergence, starting states can converge into the same sort of patterns. And minor differences in the starting state can have bigger consequences, equals butterfly effects. Starting state. Minor differences equals big divergence between extinct vs viable pattern equals butterfly effects. Starting states of asymmetry produce more dynamic systems. Minor differences dash big consequences equals butterfly effects / divergencies. Even knowing the starting state, you can't know the outcome, and vice versa. You need to go stepwise, because there's no blueprint. Only a small subset of these produce lively, animated living systems. All of these are properties of the evolution of different living system. Plants from the Mount Kenya, and plants from the Andes Mountains. Both look like the same. But they taxonomically have no connection, but they converged onto the same shape. Which means there's only 4 to 5 ways that you can survive in extreme environments. All reflect that these are cellular automata. Book, A New Kind of Science. Patterns in nature coded for small numbers of very simple local rules, and you can't predict the outcome. Called emergence. Problems. Not having enough numbers of things. You don't have enough neurons for the grandmother neuron. Solution. Neural networks. Information is not coded in a single molecule, synapse, etc. Instead, it is coded in networks, in patterns of neural activation. E.g. you need to check the video because he uses the slate, 2000 hours. A 2-layer neural network. The neurons at the bottom are boring and simple, they only know only one thing. At top, they're connected to 3 neurons, the one at the middle, know how to recognize impressionist paintings, because it's getting information at the intersection of all the specific examples. Humans vs computers. Computers do amazing sequential analytical stuff. But humans do parallel processing, patterns, resemblances, similarities, etc. You don't need neurons that do only one thing. You need neurons where each one of them is at the intersection of a bunch of other inputs. E.g. a network. One neuron fires, and a bunch of neurons send projection into it. And this neuron is for remember the name of somebody. So, you need a lot of inputs coming into that neuron, for you to be able to remember his name. Getting similarities. Creativity, are networks that are spreading far wider than normal individuals. Is making connections in neurons that others don't have. Wiring more divergent at the intersection of a bunch of networks that are acting in a convergent way. Evidence. By the time you get into the first 3 layers of the visual cortex, and the first 3 of the auditory. Once you get into the 90% called associational cortex, nobody really know what it does. There, you see neurons that are multimodal in their responses, all sort of things stimulates them. The majority of cortical neurons aren't grandmother neurons, they're at the intersection of a bunch of nets. Carl Lashley. Where in the brain individual facts are stored. Engrams. He destroyed parts of the cortex in animals. And he couldn't make the information disappear. He would have to destroy broader areas, and some memory was still in there. And he concluded there's no memory. Alzheimer's. You lose neurons in different places. Early on, they don't forget information, it's just harder to get to. In neuropsychological testing, you try to give the person cues to remember a memory. E.g. 1. You give him an orientation test. You ask him. You know the name of the president? Yes. You know the name of the last president? No. Then you give him a clue, a forced choice paradigm. You say, President Tree, President Bench, or President Bush. He says, Bush, the kid with the father also. The information is still there, but is harder to remember. You're not seeing the death of individual memories, you're seeing a weakening of a network, which is harder to get to it. E.g. 2. Early stage dementias. You ask them the name of the previous president. But now you say, the bushes on the park were so beautiful, I love look at bushes, I love to see bushes everywhere. 5 minutes later. They're more likely to remember the name Bush. There's not enough genes. But all of the previous introduces the idea of fractal genes. Genes with scale-free instructions. A tube, a part of a blood vessel, or dendrite, or whatever. The fractal rule is Grow this tube until it's 5 times longer than it is wide. Because, when it's grown 5 times longer, it bifurcates. As a result, it is split in two. Then, do the same with the shorter tube, again and again, until it generates the tree patterns, where you can get a circulatory, or pulmonary system, or a dendritic tree, just by giving a fractal instruction to genes. This is hypothetical. How much stuff can you jam into space? There's no cell in your body that is more than 5 cells away from a blood vessel. But at the same time, the circulatory system comprises less than 5% of your body mass. But how? A world of fractal geometry, which generates objects that simply cannot exist. Cantor said. Start with a line. Cut out the middle third. For those remaining 2 ones, cut out the middle third. Over and over again. As a result, you get a set of infinitely large number of objects, that take up an infinitely small amount of space. At the end, it isn't a line, it's more like dots. It's a fractal, which it's everywhere without taking up any space. Cock snowflake. A triangle. Take the middle third, and put a little triangle in it. Then on that little triangle, and so on. At the end, it has infinite perimeter, surface, and area, within a finite space. Menger sponge. A box. Take the middle third of each segment. Then the middle third of those, and so on. As a result, it has an infinite surface R, while has 0 volume. This is how the body solves the packing problem. Just to split the ends of the capillaries of the circulatory system over and over. And this is how you make a system that's everywhere, and taking up virtually no space. Fractal gene mutations. A mutation that produces a protein that's different. As a result, it's got bonds weaker between different proteins. A mutation, where instead of growing 5 times the cross-section, it's growing 4.9 times. At the end, the entire branching system is going to be compacted a bit, with consequences that are scale-free. E.g., Kallman syndrome. Problems with midline structures in the body. Septum between the nose, of the heart, and of the hypothalamus, etc. This is the same fractal mutation messing up how the embryo did symmetry. Emergent complexity. Emergence driven by biophysical properties. Paul Green. A disc. The inside was of a softer material than the material of the perimeter. If you heat the disc, the only solution is if you come up with a double saddle shape. And that's how you get a potato chip. But there's no gene that instructs potatoes to respond to heat in this way. This was the inevitable outcome of the biophysical properties of a slice of potato. Also, plant systems do the same. They develop 2 shoots, a little higher up 2 shoots in opposite direction, and so on. They're double saddles. Wisdom of the crowd. 1 Francis Galton. He went to a contest. If you guess the exact weight of an oxen, it will be yours. Farmers filled papers, but nobody got the answer right. Then, he collected all the slips of paper. He averages them, and it came out the correct weight within an ounce. 2 Who wants to be a millionaire? If you have problems to answer a question, you can ask the audience what they think is the right answer. And when the audience was asked, 91% of the time they got the right answer. This is the notion behind prediction markets. You try to predict some event. The Pentagon uses them to try to predict where the next terrorist attack might be. You get a whole bunch of experts, and they take a guess when the next one will occur. You average them. And you get a lot of valuable information. E.g. 1. A submarine sunk in the Pacific. And they didn't know where it was. They took a bunch of naval experts. They give them the last signs of life of the crew. Then, they to take a guess. They average them, and came up within 300 yards of the right location. But you need to have experienced people. E.g. 2. Ant colony. When they find something dead, they push it to their colony to eat it. And they do it, not because they know how to get to the colony, but all knows kinda which direction they need to head to reach their colony. Emergent complexity. Systems with small rules, for large number of participants. Take an ant, put it into a table, watch it. But it makes no sense. Put 100 make no sense. Put 1000 and starts making sense. Suddenly they can grow fungi, regulate temperature of the colony, etc. Out of these ants emerges a complex and adaptive system. And there's no single ant knows what the temperature should be in the colony, all emerges out of ant interactions. Small number of rules dash a lot of ants do it equals emerges complex adaptive patterns. There's no blueprints. E.g. ants. 8 different locations. You want to find the shortest possible path to reach them. Traveling salesman problem. You can't have a perfect solution, but you can have a good solution. 1. You can use a computer that do all the work and tells you where to go. Or 2. Virtual ants, swarm intelligence. You need 2 generations of ants. Put the first generation in different locations. And the rule is, that each one of them goes to another city. The ants leave a pheromone trail. But they have a finite amount of pheromone to make the path. But also, you need to know the pheromones evaporate after a while. The second generation. The rule is, they wander around randomly. And every time they find a trail, they follow it. Which means, they're reinforcing the trail. Then, a couple of thousand generations later, They solve the traveling salesman problem. You can optimize the outcome doing it this way. Telecommunications companies use swarm intelligence to know the most efficient way to do their things. 3. How bees pick a new nesting site? They look a place with a lot of food. They do their dance thing. And the ones who found a good solution, dance longer. The most efficient path, they leave the message longer. Until the point they know where to create the optimal nest. 4. Ants, bees, or whatever. But the simple rules are of attraction and repulsion, some get attracted or repulsed by each other. Then, you want to design a city. Where to put the commercial and residential districts. So, you use attraction and repulsion rules. In a commercial district, you can put a Starbucks, which attracts clothing stores, food stores, etc. At the same time, Starbucks will repulse another Starbucks. So, you put the next Starbucks far away, with the same clothing store, food store, etc. You interconnect them. And as a result, you have different commercial districts. Now, do that with a bunch of neurons. They secrete factors, which attract some types of neurons. And at the same time, they secrete factors which repel other types of neurons. At the end you have clusters of neurons sending projections. E.g. ants colonies setting up foraging paths. Some people compare it to the efficiency of the distribution of the train stations in the Tokyo subway system. Both have similar solutions. But the ants have a more optimal one. Molecules have charge. Urey and Miller, 1950s. Organic soup. Which had inorganic molecules. They pass electricity through it. Until they begun to form amino acids. The origins of life. Then, other people realized you don't need catalyst. If you put enough simple molecules that have attraction and repulsion rules, you get perturbations, spatial distributions, etc. And they will form rational structures after a while. E.g. magnets. Put a lot of magnets in rows. Not too close to each other, nice and symmetrical. Then, take a handful of metal balls, and fling them in there. Do the same 400 to 500 times. And eventually you're going to get a pyramidal structure. 5. Earthquakes. 20 little earthquakes occur every hour, all down below in the Richter scale. With this, you can graph the frequency of Richter 1.0, 2.0, and so on. And it looks like a perfect distribution. Power law distribution. E.g. 1. 50,000 people. Look at to their phone calls over the course of the year. And how far the call was. Now, you map the distance. And it's the exact same curve. E.g. 2. They took marked dollar bills. And track how far the bills had traveled a week later. And it was the exact same curve. Also, the number of links that websites have to other websites. Number of proteins showing degrees of complexity. Number of emails somebody sent over a year. Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation. It's a fractal. Applications in biology. Cellular version of the traveling salesman problem. A bunch of nodes. How you optimize the system. With solid interactions amongst clusters of nodes, and occasionally can make long-distance connections. Apply the power law distribution. And you get the optimal system. Brain development. Neurons forming in the frontal cortex. They have to figure out how to wire up with each other efficiently. And when you look at the distribution of projections, it's a power law. Most neurons in the cortex have their projections very local, and also some rare ones that have long projections. Autism. They have relative normal number of neurons in the cortex. But, the projection profiles of their neurons. If you look at them as a power law, they have a steeper curve. Which means, they have way more local connections, and have far fewer of the long-distance connections. Which produce little modules of function that are isolated from other ones. And that's what happens when you have a mutation or some epigenetic something or something prenatally, that changes the shape of the power law distribution. Gender difference in power law distribution of wiring in the cortex. Males have a little steeper distribution. Male brains are more modular in their wiring. The cortex has 2 hemispheres. Both contains the cell bodies. When projections go from one hemisphere to the other, it crosses the corpus callosum, it's a huge bundle of axons. In women, the corpus callosum is thicker. Because the power law pattern has more long-distance connections equals thicker corpus callosum. Thinner corpus callosum in men. And even thinner corpus in people with autism. Perfectly normal number of neurons. Perfectly normal number of connections between the neurons. But they're more isolated in autistic cortex. 6. Bottom-up quality control. Website selling books. You ask people to rate the books. Until you can say, people who like this book, also like this other books. E.g. Wikipedia. It's a bottom-up self-correcting system. Where normal people do the control. Some experts looked at the Wikipedia and the Encyclopedia Britannica. And they look at the hard-nosed facts about physical and life sciences. And Wikipedia was in hailing distance of the Encyclopedia Britannica level of accuracy. Bunch of people different opinions wisdom of the crowd equals self-correcting accurate, adaptive system, with no blueprints, just with very simple local rules which look for similar patterns. Or, weighted wisdom. People rate things. And those opinions are rated as well, so they become better opinions, which have more impact. Drawbacks. Systems which recommend you might like this. are very biased towards conformity. Because not all people might like them. Nonetheless, overall, it solves the problems without professional critics or blueprints or top-bottom control. How to wire them. How the cortex does swarm intelligence. When the cortex is developing, you have the first generation, a pioneer generation of cells, that grow processes, radial glial cells. They're the ants of the first generation, setting the trail. The second generation, are the wanderers. And when they hit the radial glia, they grow up along it. They keep doing this, and you get the optimal power law distribution. In humans, if you look at the neurons from a fruit fly, they're kind of the same neurons from us. Same kind of neurotransmitters, ion channels, excitability, action potentials, etc. We have similar basic building blocks. But we've 100 million of them, and out of that comes emergent properties. Garry Kasparov. Chess GM in the 90s. He played vs Deep Blue, an IBM computer. He won the first game. But the computer modified its strategy. And Garry couldn't win anymore. Chess GMS can see 4 to 5 moves ahead. And Deep Blue can calculate 7 to 8 moves in advance, and it will pick the best outcome. People told Garry that the computer only could quantity, that he shouldn't feel bad about it. But he said, with enough quantity you invent quality. And that's the equivalent to 1 ant makes no sense, but 10,000 do. We don't have more fancy neurons than any other species, we've just got more of them. Human genome sequence. Then, people sequenced chimp genome. Humans and chimps share 98% of its DNA. What's the 2%? They're disproportionately coding for transcription factors, splicing enzymes, and non-coding regions. And we have about 1,000 fewer genes for olfactory receptors than chimps do. They've been inactivated in us, pseudogens. And that's about half of the difference in the genome between humans and chimps. Also, differences in morphology, bone and hair development, reproductive genes. In respect with the brain, there are very few differences. About cell division, how many rounds of cell division these cells go through. In humans go through more rounds. If you look at the average number of neurons that each progenitor cell generates during cortical development, and if you start with the number of neurons that you find in a rhesus monkey brain, and have it to do 3 to 4 more rounds of cell division, you get a human brain. Qualitatively it's the exact same neurons, all that differs is quantity. So, the main genetics differences are genes that free you from genetic influences. They're not specifying connections, they're just specifying larger quantity. Related themes. Emphasis on quantity. Quantity with simple rules equals quality, excellence, complexity, and adaptive optimization. The simpler the building blocks, the better. Complicated ants that are specialized and have different rules, can't generate swarm intelligence. More random interactions, make better and more adaptive networks. Lots of random noise equals optimal solutions. Like, when you're making new neurons in the cortex, you induce transposable events in the genome. Randomness is a good thing. The power of gradients of information. Gradients of attraction and repulsion, which provide optimization to the system. Nearest neighbor interaction. Local interactions with simple rules. Generalists work better in these systems than specialists do. Generalist equals adaptive outcomes. On a larger level, I think, this is where the complexity of human brains and human behaviors come from. But we are the first generation. And it's not until your grandkids that they will think in emergent systems to figure out what the brain is doing. If there was more bottom-up communication in the trenches in WW1, they would have stopped the war. Where they had it? When Marcos was overthrown in the Philippines. Velvet Revolution, there was not violence, because enough people in the capital paralyzed the country and they took it over. I predict that within our lifetime, there's going to be a revolution where nobody will leave their living rooms. They will do something with something emergent bottom-up, and collapse the government. Final points. Chaotic, strange attractors. We're not in the ideal appearance, ideal intelligence, etc. What strange attractors and chaos shows? The notion of the ideal, optimal, is a myth. We are all deviating from the optima, because the optima are just an emergent, imaginary thing. Also, you're growing up with a mindset where you don't need top-bottom blueprints. And when you get complex adaptive, optimized systems, the fact that you don't need blueprints means that you don't need somebody who makes the blueprints. You don't need a source of top-down instruction if you don't need a blueprint.